In the sterile hospital air, Sophie stood frozen as Leo's life hung in the balance. She refused Ethan's offer to donate blood, her voice trembling. Direct relatives can't transfuse. Those simple words shattered 5 years of buried secrets. The CEO never imagined his ex-girlfriend had left him this profound connection after their separation. 5 years ago, Ethan and Sophie fell in love at first sight, their romance blossoming instantly. Their sweet life together lasted only 6 months before a misunderstanding tore them apart. Heartbroken and suffering from congenital heart disease, Ethan left for treatment abroad. Soon after, Sophie discovered she was pregnant, and despite all objections, she gave birth to Leo. Determined to raise their son alone, she kept this secret for years. 5 years later, Ethan returned to China for a medical checkup. At the hospital restroom, he met Leo, a boy who looked and moved just like him. They chatted happily, feeling an inexplicable connection between them. Days later, during his follow-up visit, Leo appeared again. The boy suddenly grabbed Ethan's arm and asked, "Are you married? Can you be my dad?" Ethan froze, then asked where his parents were. With innocent eyes, Leo replied, "If you say yes, then you're my dad." Their joyful chat was interrupted when Dr. Jason approached. Leo immediately called out Daddy Jason, with excitement. Ethan checked the doctor's credentials before entrusting Leo to him. The boy playfully stuck out his tongue as they parted ways. While leaving the hospital, Ethan spotted Sophie, now realizing she was Leo's mother. Seeing them laughing together like a happy family, jealousy flared in Ethan's chest. Without a word, he stormed off in a huff. Back home, Ethan grew angrier by the minute. Unable to calm down, Sophie had actually gotten married. The next day, he stormed into the hospital pretending to be sick, deliberately giving Dr. Jason a hard time. Despite normal test results, Ethan kept complaining about feeling unwell everywhere. Poor Dr. Jason was completely at a loss about what to do. Even the hospital director made sarcastic remarks about the situation. Realizing Ethan was targeting him, Dr. Jason politely excused himself by claiming he was too busy. Just as Ethan was leaving, Sophie wheeled Leo in and scolded, "Don't call handsome daddy randomly. People might get upset." This only fueled Ethan's jealousy even more. He immediately turned his anger towards Dr. Jason, accusing him of neglecting patients during work hours. Sophie's words had struck a nerve, making the CEO see red. Ethan couldn't help but lash out at the doctor, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Poor Dr. Jason found himself caught in the middle of this emotional storm. Ethan stormed out of the hospital, still burning with jealousy over Sophie and Dr. Jason. He spoke to the doctor with clear hostility in his voice. Even little Leo noticed Ethan bullying Dr. Jason. "I don't like you anymore," Leo declared angrily. Defeated, Ethan had no choice but to leave first. Fate works in mysterious ways. One day, Ethan was casually strolling through the mall when something suddenly hit him. It turned out to be little Leo, aiming a toy gun right at him. Despite his lingering resentment towards Sophie, Ethan found himself inexplicably drawn to her son. The two started playing around in the supermarket, chasing each other like it was an action movie. They kept at it, until Leo ran out of toy bullets. "Surrender your weapon," Ethan teased, pretending to be serious. With no ammo left, Leo had no choice but to raise his hands in defeat. "Look, I'm Superman," Leo proudly declared, showing off to Ethan. The CEO's heart skipped a beat when he recognized the heart monitor patch on the boy's chest. Gently lifting Leo onto the table, Ethan studied him with growing curiosity. As they chatted, the boy casually mentioned Jason wasn't his real father. A shocking realization hit Ethan. Could this be his son with Sophie? Ethan was just about to ask Leo about his birthday when Sophie rushed in. She grabbed Leo's hand and pulled him away, declaring sharply that his birthday was none of Ethan's business. Torn between love and frustration, Ethan chased after them, demanding answers. Just then, Jason appeared, creating instant tension between the men. "Stay out of this," Ethan warned through gritted teeth. Jason stood his ground, calmly advising Ethan not to act recklessly. Sophie panicked, fearing Ethan would take Leo away. She quickly diffused the tension, insisting Leo wouldn't turn 4 for another 6 months. "He has nothing to do with you," she snapped protectively. But Ethan's suspicions grew. He ordered his assistant to investigate Leo's background immediately. When the medical records arrived, Ethan's heart raced. The age didn't match Sophie's story. His hands trembled holding the document. This boy, could he really be his son? Ethan's mind raced with suspicion. He needed proof. He set a trap, asking Leo's teacher to call Sophie with a fake emergency. Leo's condition worsened. "He needs a blood transfusion," the teacher lied. "The hospital just ran out of type O blood. It'll take an hour to get more." Sophie froze in horror at the news. Relatives can't donate blood. she blurted out in panic. That slip confirmed everything for Ethan. Leo was his son. Then the teacher called back with the truth. Leo just scraped his eyelid from a fall. Sophie realized she'd been tricked. The secret was out. Ethan confronted Sophie fiercely. Why did you hide the truth from me? Sophie took a deep breath. She knew the jig was up. Leo is your son, she admitted bluntly. Yes, I've been lying. So what? Her voice trembled slightly. I was already 3 months pregnant when I found out. I couldn't bring myself to abort him, she confessed, clutching her hands together. You hated me back then. You'd never have wanted this child. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. For 5 years I raised him alone. While enduring all the gossip and judgment, she added bitterly. Ethan maintained a cold exterior, but deep down he adored Sophie and Leo. That night he couldn't contain his joy, grinning to himself. I have a son. From then on he visited Leo's school whenever possible. He even bought the boy an Iron Man helmet as a gift. Leo was thrilled, growing fond of this handsome daddy figure. Yet the child had no idea Ethan was his real father. Ethan wasted no time bonding with Sophie and Leo. He moved straight into their home. Sophie froze when she returned from work, staring at Ethan and his luggage. What is this? I'm staying, he declared, gesturing to his bags. Didn't have time to pack much. Absolutely not. Sophie crossed her arms. We broke up 5 years ago. This isn't appropriate. Ethan's fatherly instincts kicked in as he gave Sophie an ultimatum. Either let me stay, or Leo comes with me for a month. Sophie's protective side flared up instantly. No way you're taking my son anywhere, she snapped. Undeterred, Ethan plopped down on the couch. Fine, I'm not leaving then. Sophie's face turned red with anger. I'll call the police if you don't get out now, she threatened. Seeing her stubbornness, Ethan switched tactics, appealing to Leo's needs. This isn't about us. Our son needs a father's love. But Sophie wouldn't budge. Their heated argument reached a deadlock, until finally, they turned to Leo for the deciding vote. Leo's face lit up when he heard Ethan wanted to stay. Yay! Pretty daddy will sleep with me tonight, he cheered excitedly. That evening, disaster struck during Ethan's shower. When the hot water suddenly ran out, the CEO shivered violently under the icy spray. Sophie saw her chance to make him uncomfortable. She prepared Leo's tiny bed for the tall executive. If this isn't comfortable enough, you're welcome to return to your mansion, she said pointedly. At nearly 6'3", Ethan looked ridiculous, squeezed into the child-sized bed. His long legs dangled awkwardly over the edges. Used to luxury, the CEO tossed and turned all night in discomfort. Meanwhile, Sophie lay awake too, unaccustomed to having a man in her home after all these years. The next morning, a groggy Sophie stumbled out of her bedroom, completely forgetting about their unexpected guest. Spotting Ethan in her living room, she let out a startled scream. With Leo about to be late, Sophie finally gave in and got into Ethan's convertible. To her surprise, Ethan had already installed a child seat and even prepared breakfast for Leo. The little boy couldn't have been happier, grinning from ear to ear. After dropping off Leo, Sophie and Ethan headed to a crucial business meeting, representing their respective companies. They froze when opening their laptops. They had accidentally swapped computers. That morning, Sophie had asked Leo to help pack her bag and the little boy had mixed up their devices. Panic set in. Switching laptops now would expose their secret relationship. The room buzzed with whispers, as everyone noticed their awkward silence. With no other choice, Sophie delivered an impromptu presentation flawlessly, having managed the project herself. Ethan simply watched with a proud smile, letting her shine in the spotlight. After the meeting, Sophie slipped into Ethan's office to confront him, but he beat her to it, accusing her of trying to expose their secret relationship. Not wanting to argue, Sophie made up an excuse and hurried out. That evening brought even more awkwardness. Leo insisted both parents sleep with him. Sophie tried refusing, but the boy wouldn't take no for an answer. The next morning, Sophie woke up nestled in Ethan's arms, her face burning with embarrassment. Ethan stirred awake too, prompting Sophie to fake sleep, though Leo instantly saw through her act. Leo shook Sophie vigorously, telling her to stop pretending to sleep and pointing out her fluttering eyelashes. Sophie had no choice but to open her eyes, only for Leo to suddenly ask, "You slept together? Does that mean you'll never separate?" Sophie scolded him for the inappropriate question, just as Jason arrived and froze at the scene. Panicking, Sophie quickly pulled Jason back to her place to explain, leaving Ethan frustrated and pacing at home. After a long wait, Sophie finally returned, only to face Ethan's jealous outburst. Why are you so close with Jason? Ethan demanded, his voice sharp with suspicion. Sophie sighed, explaining that Jason was both her close friend and Leo's doctor. He saw everything, so I had to tell him, she said calmly. But Ethan's mind kept racing. Was she just worried about Jason's feeling? That afternoon, Ethan finalized a partnership with Jiaxie Hospital and invited everyone to dinner. Just then, Jason showed up unexpectedly. Sparks flew between the rivals. The oblivious hospital director invited Jason to join them. I need to go home and make ribs for Leo. Jason declined politely. Sophie also excused herself from the dinner. Watching them laugh together, Ethan's jealousy burned even hotter. Ethan saw right through Jason's intentions. The doctor clearly prioritized family time. He made an excuse to skip dinner and headed home watching Sophie and Jason work together so smoothly twisted his heart. He felt like an outsider in his own family. Jason wasn't backing down either. He'd loved Sophie for 5 years. He'd been there for her and Leo when no one else was. Now with Ethan's return, the two men exchanged sharp words. Their rivalry intensified with every passing moment. Sophie returned from her phone call, her face lighting up at the sight of the fish stew. Ethan's chest tightened as he watched Jason shower Sophie with attention. After dinner, Ethan pulled Sophie aside. You can date whoever you want, he said through gritted teeth. But don't just bring random men home. Sophie turned to Ethan with a gentle sigh. Jason is Leo's pediatrician, and my close friend, she explained softly. He genuinely cares for our son. Leo suddenly tugged at Ethan's sleeve excitedly. I want to sleep with Uncle Jason tonight, the boy chirped. Ethan's jaw tensed as he forced a polite refusal. Disappointed, Leo ran back to Sophie. That was just your imagination, sweetheart, she said, ruffling his hair. We've never actually slept together. Sophie's company held a staff dinner party. Kevin, the R&D director, took advantage of his position to harass a new female colleague. He deliberately spilled wine on her dress, then pretended to help wipe it off. Sophie and another colleague couldn't stand watching this. They stepped forward immediately to intervene. Instead of backing down, Kevin lashed out angrily. He publicly accused Sophie of having loose morals. The entire room fell silent in shock. Just then, Ethan returned from his business meeting and witnessed the scene. Without hesitation, he punched Kevin hard and stormed off with authority. Sophie snapped out of her shock and quickly ran after him to thank him. Ethan was furious because their son Leo had been called a fatherless bastard. Instead of fighting back, Sophie humbly apologized, which surprised Ethan. Just then, Sophie's best friend suddenly appeared, forcing them to quickly duck behind a billboard. Sophie instinctively clung to Ethan, her heart racing at the thought of their secret being exposed. Only after her friend left did Sophie finally release him, nervously explaining it was just an emergency cover-up. The next day, Kevin foolishly tried bothering Sophie again at work. Sophie snapped at him fiercely this time, sending the troublemaker away with his tail between his legs. Just then, Ethan's luxury car arrived to pick up Sophie.
Kevin spotted her getting into the fancy vehicle and immediately snapped photos. When the driver made a sharp turn, Sophie stumbled into Ethan's arms, right as Kevin captured the compromising shot. The next day, office gossip exploded as everyone saw the photos. Ethan burst into Sophie's office, fuming with anger. He snapped that her private life was none of his business, but he'd intervene for Leo's sake. Sophie stood frozen, completely baffled by his sudden outburst. Little did Ethan know, he was actually the center of this scandal. Sophie clenched her fists, barely holding back from slapping him. She shoved the photos at him, proving she wasn't involved with any other man. Ethan examined them closely, then his face darkened with realization. Who did this? He growled through gritted teeth. Without another word, he stormed off to confront Kevin. The next day, Ethan summoned Kevin to discuss a project collaboration at the company. Kevin was overjoyed, thinking his big break had finally arrived. Little did he know, Ethan had a power move planned. Ethan led him to the parking lot, casually mentioning he'd bought a new car. Take a look, Ethan said, his tone deceptively light. Kevin's smile froze when he recognized Sophie's car from yesterday. In that moment, he realized Sophie wasn't someone to mess with. Later that evening, Sophie's best friend noticed Sophie was overwhelmed with work and invited her to unwind at a bar. Sophie had a low alcohol tolerance and got drunk quickly after just a few drinks. Her friend had no choice but to help her outside as she stumbled. I can still drink, Sophie slurred stubbornly, swaying on her feet. Helpless, she called Jason for assistance. Jason arrived promptly and carefully guided Sophie home.
Just as they reached the apartment hallway, Ethan spotted them. His eyes darkened as he stormed over and yanked Jason's hand away from Sophie. "Leave," Ethan commanded coldly, pulling Sophie protectively into his arms. Jason hesitated, but ultimately walked away without another word. Ethan finally managed to get Sophie into bed and took off her shoes. She curled up in pain as her stomach condition flared up. He rushed to find stomach medicine for her. "People say the one you think of when drunk is your true love," Sophie murmured, mistaking Ethan for a dream and pulling him into a sudden kiss. Ethan's heart raced wildly as he escaped to take a cold shower, but the memory kept replaying in his mind, making him grin like an idiot. This was their first intimate moment in 5 years. The next morning, Sophie woke up to find Ethan sitting nearby. Memories of last night flooded her mind, making her jolt in shock. She couldn't tell if it was reality or a dream. Seeing Ethan casually sipping coffee, she thought it must be a dream. "You always act like this when drunk," Ethan suddenly remarked. "Last night you?" Sophie's face burned with embarrassment as realization hit. Sophie buried her face in the pillow, still burning with embarrassment from last night's memories. Ethan watched her carefully wiping coffee stains, noticing how worn her laptop looked. "I'll get you a new computer," he offered casually, then smirked. "Maybe drink less next time." Her flushed cheeks and flustered reactions secretly delighted him. The way she fumbled with her coffee cup only made Ethan's smile grow wider. There was something endearing about seeing the usually composed Sophie so flustered. He found himself enjoying these little moments more than he'd expected. On Sunday, Ethan and Sophie took Leo to the amusement park for a fun family outing. They tried their luck at the claw machine, laughing as Leo cheered them on. The carousel spun them around, with Leo waving excitedly from his colorful horse. Bumper cars brought out their competitive sides, crashing and giggling like kids. They explored nearly every attraction, their laughter echoing through the park. Watching Sophie's carefree smile, Ethan felt their old connection rekindling. By day's end, the three left hand in hand, hearts full of joy and warmth. But their happiness was short-lived. One day, Sophie went to Ethan's office to collect a project proposal, only to find him absent. On his desk, she spotted a custody lawsuit document for Leo, and her heart shattered. As she rushed out in tears, she bumped into Ethan in the hallway. "Get away from me," she screamed, convinced he'd only reconnected to take their son. Ethan had no idea about this. His assistant misunderstood his intentions and reported to the chairman, causing a huge misunderstanding. He tried to explain, but Sophie wouldn't listen. She threw his luggage out the door immediately. Heartbroken, Ethan realized she saw him as a ruthless man now. Leo was Sophie's bottom line. This betrayal truly shattered her heart. The CEO sighed in frustration, watching his belongings scattered on the doorstep. That evening, Leo noticed Ethan's toiletries were missing. With trembling lips, he asked Sophie, "Did Daddy abandon us again?" Sophie forced a smile, telling him his father was away on business. The boy and his dad had grown so close. Leo desperately wanted to call Ethan. Sophie gently took the phone away, her heart aching at his crushed expression. Watching her son's pain, Sophie felt a storm of emotions she couldn't name. Meanwhile, Ethan tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep. The next morning, hearing Sophie was sick, he rushed over immediately. Fate played its hand. He ran into Jason, his romantic rival, at the door. The two immediately locked horns over Sophie's care. Just as their argument heated up, Sophie opened the door. Jason smoothly said he came to check on her, while Ethan got shut out cold. Ethan stormed home after Sophie shut the door on him. Fuming with anger, back at his place, everything irritated him. He summoned his assistant to replace all the furnishings. He even lashed out at the assistant with personal insults. Just then, the assistant's phone rang. It was Leo calling. The assistant deliberately answered loudly. "Hello, Sophie?" Ethan instantly snatched the phone away. "Daddy, why did you move out?" Leo's innocent voice asked. "Just a business trip, buddy." Ethan softened his tone. "When will you come back?" The boy persisted. "Listen, Mommy," Ethan replied gently. "I'll take you to play when I return." Leo squealed with delight, his joy echoing through the phone. Soon after, Sophie had a business trip to Shanghai and decided to bring Leo along for a change of scenery. Ethan secretly upgraded their flight tickets when she found out. At check-in, the hotel staff informed Sophie they'd been upgraded to a luxury suite as the 888th guest. The suite was filled with children's toys. Sophie immediately knew Ethan was behind it. Without hesitation, she demanded to be moved back to a standard room. After settling in, Sophie video called Jason, demanding answers. "Did you tell Ethan about our Shanghai trip?" Just then, Ethan arrived to surprise Sophie and Leo, but a woman suddenly appeared and kissed him right in front of them.
Sophie and Leo froze at the shocking scene. Ethan quickly explained. The woman was his sister, also his boss who'd been overseas for years. She'd returned specifically for Ethan's family matters. Earlier, Ethan had sent her their family photo, and she'd immediately adored Sophie and Leo. But her awkward phrasing made Sophie think she wanted custody of Leo. Furious, Sophie grabbed Leo's hand and stormed off. Ethan stood there confused as Sophie yelled at him before leaving. Heartbroken by his sister's actions, Ethan drowned his sorrows at a bar. When women tried flirting with him, he brushed them off, his mind filled only with thoughts of Leo. The next morning, Ethan made his painful decision. Though it tore him apart, he chose to voluntarily give up custody of Leo. Custody of Leo meant everything to Sophie. The contract promised weekly visits, so she signed eagerly, unaware of Ethan's hidden agenda. Ethan wanted the best of both worlds, so he suggested a family camping trip. Sophie agreed without hesitation. At the beach, the trio played joyfully. Leo beamed with happiness, and Sophie smiled for the first time in ages. Back home, father and son battled as Iron Man versus Ultraman, while Sophie watched, working on her laptop until sleep took her. Ethan carried her gently to bed, but when he laid her down, her eyes fluttered open, their moment of tenderness interrupted by Leo tossing in his sleep. Through these shared moments, Sophie slowly began accepting Ethan again. The next day at the summit opening, Ethan accompanied Sophie with Leo by their side. Sophie delivered a well-prepared speech that earned thunderous applause from the executives. Her company's products attracted numerous partnership interests. Ethan gazed at Sophie with undisguised affection, fueling Lily's jealousy. At the evening cocktail party, Lily publicly accused Sophie of having questionable morals. She doesn't even know who her child's father is, Lily declared maliciously. All eyes turned to Sophie, as Jason tried to stop Lily's tirade, but she ignored him. Sophie flushed with embarrassment under the public scrutiny. Then Ethan stepped forward with commanding presence. I am Leo's father, he announced, silencing the crowd. He severed all business ties with Lily on the spot, cradling Leo in one arm and holding Sophie's hand with the other. Ethan felt complete happiness. That evening, Sophie couldn't believe everything was real. Ethan's actions left her utterly confused. With liquid courage, she finally asked if he still had feelings for her. Just as Ethan was about to answer, Sophie suddenly vomited all over him. The next morning, hungover Sophie groaned at her terrible timing. She resolved to confront Ethan about their unfinished conversation. But Ethan beat her to it. He'd prepared a heartfelt confession. I'll spend my whole life making up for the 5 years you raised Leo alone, he vowed. Tears welled in Sophie's eyes, as she realized their separation might have been fate's test. Ethan pulled out the 5-year-old bracelet, ready to answer Sophie's question from last night. Just as the words were about to leave his lips, Daniel burst in, accusing Sophie of being responsible for his sister Susan's death. Ethan's expression darkened. He too suspected Sophie might be involved. At that moment, Sophie's friend rushed into Sophie's apartment, sensing the tense atmosphere immediately. Heartbroken and furious, Sophie shoved both men out of her home. Sophie's friend chased after them, demanding an explanation. You're a fool to doubt her sincerity, her shouted at Ethan. Furious at how Sophie was being treated, heartbroken but determined, Sophie decided to take Ethan and Daniel back to Shiquan Town to find eyewitnesses and clear her name. After settling in Shiquan Town that evening, Sophie accidentally overheard Daniel calling her a liar. To her shock, Ethan agreed with Daniel's accusation. I'll never forgive whoever killed Susan, Ethan added coldly. Devastated, Sophie turned away before hearing Ethan's unfinished sentence. But I still believe in Sophie. The next morning, Sophie and the others tracked down an eyewitness using photos. The witness described how the bus had suddenly lost control, causing chaos inside. Sophie desperately tried to pull Susan up after she fell. In the panic, the witness grabbed Sophie and dragged her to safety. The bus then tumbled down the hillside. Susan had gone back for her wallet, containing her brother's photo, missing her chance to escape. With the truth revealed, Sophie finally cleared her name. Daniel had no choice but to apologize. Sophie cleared the misunderstanding with Ethan, but now there was distance between her and Ethan. Determined to fix things, Ethan first texted her, but Sophie ignored his messages. Undeterred, he showed up at her office, only to be met with cold professionalism. Sophie insisted on keeping their relationship strictly work-related, forcing Ethan to leave. Despite her rejection, Ethan wasn't ready to give up. He kept searching for ways to win her back. Sophie remained cold toward Ethan, but he was determined to mend their relationship. Clueless about how to win her back, Ethan turned to his digital assistant for advice.
The assistant teased him while sharing the old saying, persistence wears down resistance in romance. Taking this to heart, Ethan rushed to Sophie's place with Leo to invite her to a movie. Leo excitedly tugged at Sophie's hand, but she firmly declined. She'd only promised to spend time with Leo, not join Ethan. Yet Ethan refused to give up, continuing his relentless pursuit, despite her rejection. That night, Ethan met up with his friend at a bar, both nursing broken hearts. His buddy convinced him that six-pack abs would win women's hearts, urging Ethan to show off his charm. The next day, Sophie took Leo swimming, only for Ethan to show up in a ridiculous six-pack printed swimsuit. Sophie cringed at the sight, mortified, telling Ethan to leave her alone. Determined to impress, Ethan challenged a nearby hunk to a competition. Sophie and Leo ended up cheering from the sidelines despite themselves. Just as the competition reached its climax, Ethan suddenly stopped, clutching his chest in pain. Sophie immediately jumped into the pool, her voice trembling as she asked if he was okay. Ethan waved it off, telling her to listen to his heartbeat instead. Without hesitation, Sophie pressed her ear against his chest. Later at the hospital for a heart checkup, Leo video called his father. Sophie took the phone to discuss work, but noticed something odd about Ethan's background. His evasive answers only deepened her suspicion. Ethan quickly made an excuse about being busy and hung up, thinking he'd fooled Sophie. But Sophie saw right through his lie. She called his assistant and discovered Ethan was actually hospitalized. Rushing to the hospital with Leo in tow, Sophie arrived just as Jason was examining Ethan. With worry in her eyes, Sophie asked about his condition. Ethan tensed up, shooting Jason an annoyed look for not covering for him. He never wanted Sophie to worry about him. That night, Ethan woke to find Sophie and Leo keeping vigil by his bedside. A wave of warmth washed over him at the sight. He realized he'd never feel alone again. Even in sickness, his family would be there. But their peaceful moment was shattered when his sister rushed into the hospital room. Ethan frowned at his sister's terrible timing. "Couldn't you wait until they left?" Her explained she wasn't just visiting. She had business news. Bayan selling their company. Interested? His eyes lit up immediately. Acquiring Bayan meant seeing Sophie daily and fulfilling her grandfather's legacy. "Help me check out," Ethan demanded, already sitting up despite his weakness. His sister hesitated, concerned about his health, but his stubbornness wore her down. With a resigned sigh, she finally agreed to arrange his discharge. Soon after, Ethan was discharged from the hospital. He and Leo teamed up with Puppy Dog Eyes to convince Sophie to care for him. Sophie reluctantly agreed to stay, but set strict rules. "Only call me for meals, medicine or water, nothing else." Ethan grinned mischievously. "What about showers or bathroom break?" Sophie rolled her eyes at his antics. The next day at the hospital, her boss Damien unexpectedly crossed paths with Sophie. "Guanchao's bidding for Bayan too," he revealed smoothly. "Want details? Let's talk outside." Sophie hesitated. Bayan's AI modeling was her life's work. With a tight nod, she followed him. To everyone's shock, Damien had been harboring inappropriate desires for Sophie all along. At the beach, he finally showed his true colors, making unwanted advances while claiming he'd remember her for 5 years. Disgusted, Sophie used self-defense skills from her gym training to quickly pin him down, though the ordeal left her shaken. Just then, Ethan arrived at the scene. Back home, Sophie trembled in Ethan's arms as she revealed the truth. 5 years ago, Guanchao fired her because Damien falsely accused her of seducing him. Ethan's heart ached hearing this, and he vowed to make Damien pay. The battle between the two men began in earnest. At the hospital, Damien confronted Ethan. "Did you ever suspect Sophie was using you?" Ethan admitted his past doubts had hurt her, then fired back. "You don't love her, you just want to possess her." His voice turned steel cold. "As long as I'm breathing, no one lays a finger on Sophie." That night, Sophie rushed to the hospital and overheard Ethan's conversation with Damien. Later, Ethan returned home and noticed Sophie still awake. With a gentle smile, he invited Sophie for a talk under the tree. Under the moonlight, they reminisced about the past with heartfelt sincerity. Sweet words flowed between them as they shared their feelings. Ethan apologized sincerely for his previous recklessness. Sophie felt deeply touched by his remorse. Warmth filled her heart as she realized Ethan was truly trustworthy. Sophie gently took out the bracelet she had kept for 5 years. Her hands trembling slightly, with hopeful eyes, she asked Ethan if he'd wear it again. Ethan's face lit up as he immediately reached for the delicate chain. His fingers moved with urgency as he fastened it around her wrist. Their eyes met, and in that moment, all the years apart seemed to disappear. A warm understanding passed between them, deepening their rekindled connection. The next morning, Sophie woke up groggily, rubbing her sleepy eyes. She blinked in surprise to find little Leo staring intently at them. "You're so mean," the boy shouted, his voice trembling with childish indignation.